Hi everyone, Victor here again, and I welcome you to this lesson which is creating and managing Kubernetes OpenShift objects by using the declarative approach. And the declarative simply means, hey, come on, this is what I want to do. This is the end result of what I want to do. I don't know how you're going to do it, but I just want you to do it for me. So you're just declaring the end result of what is going to be done. And the language we're going to be using for this declaration is YAML. So we're going to be working with the YAML configuration file. So in this lesson, you will learn some Kubernetes or OpenShift resources such as label, selector, template, and annotation. In previous lessons, we have always created our Kubernetes OpenShift component by using the imperative approach, that is, by using ad hoc. And like I said, ad hoc simply means basic commands. And really, in the production environment, it is impractical to always use these basic commands to create Kubernetes objects. Kubernetes objects are always created by using the declarative approach, that is, by using the YAML configuration file most of the time, because the YAML configuration file simplifies deployment and the features that is required for this deployment. I mean, all the features can be added to the YAML file at once, and this can be easily applied without breaking a sweat. And more so, the YAML file can be integrated into your code, which makes deployment more easier. So in this lesson, we will look at how to create some of the Kubernetes objects such as pod, deployment, and service by using the YAML configuration file. YAML is an human readable language and it contains easily readable syntax. Hence, your code can become your documentation because they are easy to read. The YAML syntax is written in the form of a key value pair, and the heartbeat of YAML is indentation, that is, child-parent relationship with white spacings. It's all about nesting parameters. And this indentation is very important when it comes to YAML because when you miss it, it means that your code will not run. Never mind and don't worry, if you don't really understand YAML, you will understand better as we go on in this course. In Kubernetes and OpenShift YAML configuration file, there are basically 5 parts, which are the API version, kind, metadata, spec, which is specification, and status. So let's start with the API version. Every Kubernetes or OpenShift object have their different types of API version. For pod, the API version is v1. For deployment, the API version is apps/v1, and for service, the API version is v1. So this is a key, while this is the value, hence the word key value pair. So that's for the YAML. When you're writing a YAML, like I said, it's always in the key value pair format. The second part of the configuration file is kind. The kind key or parameter is the kind of resources you want to create. So for pod, the kind of resources will be pod. For deployment, the kind is deployment. And for service, the kind is service. And the third part of the YAML configuration file is metadata. The metadata is the data or information about the resource you are creating. One of the parameters in this section is name. Here, you will specify the name you wish to give the resource you are creating. Another parameter you can specify in this section is label. So what is label? You would agree that the essence of labeling is to be able to identify the attributes of an object based on the labels on the object. For example, if you have 10 pods in your cluster, depending on the job function each pod does, you can choose to group them by labels. So for instance, let's say pod A, B, and C are the front-end applications. You can choose to label them by these attributes so that anytime you query pods that are front-end applications, you will get pod A, B, and C. So labels are part of the metadata section of a Kubernetes or OpenShift resource that can be assigned to an object or a resource based on their attributes. So you can add labels to your ports, deployment, service, and some other Kubernetes resources. So under labels, for this pod, we can specify a label key as app, and we can also use a value called nginx. So if I wish, I can also specify another label as environ and use a value of production. If I want to specify a label name, I can also do that. You can specify as many labels as you want. It just depends on how you want to group your resources. Before I continue, let me quickly show you one of the easy way to create your own YAML configuration file using the Kubernetes website. So when you go to kubernetes.io, so from here you can go to documentation, I think. Then from documentation, let's see. Okay, let's go to reference. From reference, let's go to Kubernetes API workload resources. So you can see pod. I can just right click and open pod here. For deployment, I can open it in another tab. And for service, since we are dealing with these three resources, so I'm just going to open for pod, deployment, and service. And now you can see here that pod is blah, blah, blah. You can see the API version, which is V1. Like I said, they're divided into 5 parts. The API version, the kind, the metadata, the spec, and status. So for API version, you can see that for pod is V1, the kind is pod. If you want to see more information about the metadata, you can click here to see. The same thing goes for deployment, and the same thing goes for service as well, right? So for deployment, for example, let me just open more information about the metadata here. You can see that in metadata, you can have the name, and it is telling you that the name must be unique with a namespace, blah blah blah. The namespace, the labels, you know. So when you go through all of these, you will see that with the Kubernetes website, you can easily create a YAML configuration file. It is very simple to create. Even if you click here, this port spec, you can see that for port spec, you need to put the parameter containers, and it's saying that the parameter containers is required. And here too, the name string is required. So whenever you say required, it means that you must put in that parameter. Wherever, if you don't say required, it means that you might not really need that parameter. If you don't want to use it, you might not put it, but when you say required, it means that the parameter is required. So meaning that the name of a container is required. Having said that, the fourth part of the configuration file is specification, shortened as spec. You know, when you see a guy or a girl that meets your criteria, you say something like, wow, this is my spec. Now that's simply specification. Yeah, that's simply specification. So this part of the configuration file will contain the specification of the desired behavior of the resource you are creating. So for pod spec, you can have parameters like containers, and in the container section, you can have list of items such as the container name, the image, the port, and etc. If you check the Kubernetes site, you will see that the container name is required. You will also specify the container image. So because I did not specify a tag, I will definitely have the latest version of the Nginx being pulled. Like I have mentioned, you need to have the basic knowledge of container runtime, such as Docker, Podman, Containerd, or whatsoever container runtime before studying this course, so you will understand the structure of container images and other basic things. I'll be dropping the link to my Docker and Podman course in the description box below if you're interested and if you do not have the basic knowledge of how container works. So another parameter in this section can be the container port. And you can also have another list of items here. So we can have container port to be 8080, and because you can have more than one container in a pod, if you wish, you can also add the other container information just like this. But because I only want one container in this pod, I'm going to remove this part and make sure that I have just this information for this container. And also for deployment spec, don't forget this is we're talking about the pod spec. And for deployment spec, you can have parameters like replicas. You can also have parameters like templates. So what is a template? A template is the pod specification. So in this section, in the template section, you will specify the pod template specification. Don't forget that deployment manages pods, so you need to specify the container or pod specs in the deployment too. And this will be done in the template section. In the template section, you can have parameters like metadata, spec, and etc. It's just like, putting the metadata part of the spec part of the pod inside the template section of the deployment configuration file. After all, the deployment manages the pod, so there should be a pod configuration file in the deployment as well. And we can also have parameters like selector in the spec section. So what is selector? Selector work hand in hand with labels to establish connections among other Kubernetes resources. There is a tight handshake between these two resources, label and selector, and label and selector work hand in hand to connect pods and deployment together. Label and selector also work hand in hand to connect services and deployment, and among other resource connections. So for deployment, a required parameter in the selector section is to match labels. This is actually a label selector. So this will match the label here in the pod section so that there can be a connection between the deployment and the pod. So you need to watch out for the key value pair you use in this label and selector section, because if you do not make sure that this label matches, you're going to be having issues because there won't be a connection between the two resources. And for the service component, we can have the selector parameter. Like I mentioned that label and selector work hand in hand. So the selector here, which is the app equals Nginx, will be used to connect this service to the deployment or pod as the case may be. This is how the service finds ports to forward packets to. In the spec section, we can also have the port parameter. We can specify the name of the port and the port you would like the app to be exposed to, including the target port, that is the port the app uses, and you can also specify the type of service. So in this case, the type of service, of course, is node port. If you want it to be load balancer, you specify load balancer, and if you want it to be cluster IP, you specify it to be cluster IP. And the last part of the YAML configuration file is status. You can see that for now we cannot see status here, and that's because the status part is automatically generated by Kubernetes, and it will be added automatically by Kubernetes when the resources has been created. So having understood this, let us apply this YAML configuration file one by one. We will start with pod. We would apply pod, and after which we apply deployment and service. So let's go practical. Before we start to apply these YAML files, let me open one of the components. Let's open the deployment file. So I'm just going to say vi deploy to.yaml. So here you can see the types, the part of the configuration file. So you can see that the first one here is API version, the second one here is kind, the third one is metadata, the fourth one is spec, and like I said, the fifth one, which is status, is always automatically generated. So you can, I just want to quickly explain the indentations. So you can see that for the main part, like I said, YAML is the parent-child relationship. So let me move this here. So for the main part, which is the API version, you can see that they all start from the same line. That is the API version, the kind, the metadata, the spec. So let me just push this here. You can see that they are all starting from the same line, and that's because they are parents when it comes to indentation. And for the API version, the value is apps/v1 here. For kind, the value is deployment. And for metadata, because we can have various values, we can have various parameters under metadata. So those parameters are going to become the children to the parent, which is metadata, and that is why they will never start from the same line as metadata. So you can see that name did not start from the same line as metadata. Because it is a child to metadata, it's going to have, some spacings, and then it's going to start from this side, and then you can have the name, you can have the value of the name to be Nginx application. And also under metadata, we also have a parameter which is labels. And because we can also have different, numerous labels, this label, this is one of labels, it becomes a child to the parent label. And don't forget that even labels is a child to the parent, which is metadata. So that is indentation, which really matters. It's very simple to grasp. When you can understand the parent-child relationship, the indentation in YAML, then you're good to go. So you can look at the spec here too. You can see that for spec, we have different values. So we have the replicas here, and we have the key to be 2. Under spec, we have template. These are children to the parent, which is spec. And if you come down also, you can also see that even selector here is not starting with spec because it is a child to the parent spec. So this is all about YAML. This is all about child-parent relationship. If you've gone through my Ansible course, we also did this. We explained this too. And what I did to be able to edit my VI so that I can be able to get the right indentation, which is this line, is that I made some settings. I'm going to be dropping the link in the description box below on how I made those settings. And also, if you don't want to use the VI, you can use your VS Code. And even as a matter of fact, you can have your Kubernetes extension being included in your VS Code. Maybe one of these days I'm just going to do a lesson on that. When you have that extension being included in your VS Code, you can easily create any Kubernetes resources, and you have the templates in there, and you can easily write on those templates. So having understood this, you should also know that you can make use of YAML validator. So there are a lot of YAML validators online just to be able to see if you've rightly written this configuration file. So this is all about it. So having understood this, let's see how we can apply this component. So let's start with pod. If I open the YAML file, which is pod2.yml, so here I'm going to remove the second container parameter because I just want one container in this pod. So I'm just going to remove this parameter here. And now I'm going to save this. So to apply this configuration file, so what I'm also going to be doing is that I'm going to be dropping the link to this documentation in the description box below so that you can just easily copy and paste. So right now, to apply this configuration file, I'm just going to use the command kubectl apply option apply file pod2.yml. So now you can see that this pod has been created. So I can do kubectl get pod. So you can see that the pod is running and it's been created. If I wish, I can also do kubectl get pod o wide. You can see the internal IP of the pod. And also if I do, I can also, describe the pod if I want to as well. For the deployment configuration file, if I do vi deploy 2.yml, so this is the configuration file for deployment, and this has replicas of 2. So I can save this file, and to apply this, I can also do kubectl apply -f deploy 2.yml. So you can see that the deployment has been created. So if I do get deployment or deploy, kubectl, don't mind me. So you can see that the deployment has been created. However, we haven't seen the port running. So we need to see 2 ports running because we have 2 replicas. So if I do this again, so you can see that the ports are already running. So if I do kubectl get ports, you can see that we have the ports, the 2 replicas of the port running. This is the first pod we created without using deployment. And also for service, if I do vi service2.yml, you can see the information about the service here, the service name, which is Nginx application, right? So I can just save this file and I can do kubectl apply service2.yml, and if I do kubectl get service, so you can see that the service has also been created. This is how you can use the YAML configuration file to create components. And if you want to edit, let's say you want to do some editing, let's do that for deploy to the YML. So if I change replicas from 2 to let's say 3, and I save this, and if I do kubectl apply deploy to the YAML, so you can see that now it's saying that it's been configured, not created. So that's how, if you want some changes in your environment, you can always edit the file. And now if I do kubectl get ports, we should have 4 ports running in total now. And that's because the new pod has been created 17 seconds ago. I would like to talk more about label and selector, but because this video, I don't like my videos to be too long, so I'll just keep that till the next lesson. So in the next lesson, I'll just talk more, briefly about label and selector. So thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like, comment, and share. By doing that, you will encourage us to do more. And bye for now.